Okay. I just had a donut. It was delicious. It was lemon-filled. Oh, it's wonderful. Okay. Let's get back into part 2. Somebody who lived in the area just informed Lee that Howard left his flank exposed. So, ow. Let's get into the video.
Aware of their difficult position and intrigued by the opportunity, Jackson immediately proposed to Lee the most audacious maneuver in the entire war. He urged Lee to split his already outnumbered force in half. Jackson, with 28,000 men, would leave that night to fall upon the unsuspecting Union right in the course of the day. Lee, with the remaining 15,000, scarcely a division in size, would engage in aggressive feints to occupy the attention of Hooker's 70,000 men. Either astounded by his subordinates' daring or recognizing a better option did not exist, a remarkably composed Lee agreed. At 4 a.m. on May 2nd, advanced troops under Robert Rhodes moved out, followed by the divisions of Colston and A.P. Hill. An early rainfall deadened the sound of marching feet, and, as morning dawned, generated a low-lying fog that further obscured the Confederates' movements. By 7:30 a.m., Jackson's men turned onto the wilderness byways, with the weather getting warmer and drier. Shortly after Jackson's foot cavalry made their turnoff, Hooker, increasingly nervous from the day before, inspected his lines. Dissatisfied by Howard's position, he ordered Reynolds' 1st Corps up from Fredericksburg to cross and further bolster his right flank. Unfortunately, as a result of his countermand the day before, Banks's Ford had not been secured, resulting in a longer trek to cross at U.S. Ford. The day would become a race to see which side can get to the Wilderness Church first. At 9 a.m., as Hooker completed his inspection, the first of Lee's feigned assaults began against the Union left. Around the same time, advance units from 3rd Corps, forming a salient near Hazel Grove, observed Confederate soldiers near Catherine's Furnace. The aggressive Sickles pushed his men forward while sending a messenger back to headquarters. Hooker gave him a free hand to harass the enemy. As fighting continued into the afternoon, Lee funneled Posey's brigade south to press Sickles on his flank and slow down his assault. Meanwhile, Hooker moved Slocum into the area and depleted his available reserves to reinforce 3rd Corps. This concentration of men created a significant salient in the Union line, and the limited road network would make it increasingly difficult for effective relief to be sent to either flank, but Hooker remained unconcerned. He was confident that the near arrival of Reynolds' Corps will make up the difference. At 2:30 p.m., a large push from Sickles captured most of the 23rd Georgia, Jackson's rearguard. Assessing the action and the southwesterly direction of the Confederate movement, Hooker tried to convince himself that Lee is in retreat. The Union commander sent a fast rider to Fredericksburg, urging Sedgwick to assault the heights, which he is confident must be practically undefended, before nightfall. Hooker also sought confirmation for his belief from Howard, urging the Corps commander to send pickets forward into the undergrowth. Scouts from 11th Corps had already alerted their superiors to the presence of Confederates in the vicinity, but a dubious Howard dismissed this as the offspring of fears. He had his men construct shallow rifle pits, but did little more. Even as Sickles was gathering up Jackson's rearguard, the first soldiers of Rhodes' division reached their destination on the Union flank. Over the next 2.5 hours, the Confederates moved into position north of the Orange Turnpike. Rhodes and Colston were to lead the way, with the aggressive A.P. Hill in reserve to exploit their gains. It was now 5 p.m. The sun was setting, and the soldiers of 11th Corps were preparing their suppers. As the sun was setting, Jackson told Rhodes to go forward. The assault was devastating. Men of the 41st and 45th New York simply turned and ran, while their compatriots in the 54th New York and the 153rd Pennsylvania fired 2 volleys before breaking and running. Some companies of the 75th Ohio attempted a countercharge in desperation, which briefly slowed the onslaught before they, too, were caught up in the maelstrom and swept down the turnpike. Completely startled by the course of events, General Howard seized the national standard in the stump of his right arm and bravely rode among his men, urging them to rally to the colors, but to no avail. The entire Union right broke, and the fleeing men crashed into the flank of 3rd Corps, which was forced to turn face and reform in the growing darkness. In less than 90 minutes, the Union line had been pushed back over a mile. However, growing darkness, the difficult terrain, and increasing northern resistance slowed down the Confederate advance, and by 8 p.m. the lines had stabilized. Well aware that the Confederate disadvantage in numbers and their split position could be seen in the daylight and easily be exploited by a more energetic commander, Stonewall Jackson moved among his lines like a man possessed, eager to bring up A.P. Hill's fresh reserves. He seemed poised for a night attack along the new Union right to cut them off from U.S. Ford and surround them in the wilderness. In the evening fog and mist, Jackson and his staff rode out on reconnaissance, but soon realized the enemy are much closer than expected. As they returned to their lines around 9:30 p.m., pickets from the 18th North Carolina mistook them for Union cavalry and fired first a few shots and then 2 volleys into the group of horsemen. Jackson was hit near both wrists and more seriously injured by a bullet that entered his left arm above the elbow, shattering the bone and rupturing an artery. As he was transported to the rear for amputation, Jackson entrusted his corps command to A.P. Hill. Misfortune continued to plague the Confederacy. Less than an hour after taking command, Hill was hit by a piece of shrapnel in the leg that prevented him from walking or riding across the front. Like Jackson, Hill was aware of the vital importance of having a bold and aggressive commander in charge of the vulnerable southern position on the morrow. In an unusual decision, he passed command to Jeb Stuart, who, although a dashing cavalry commander and full of bravado, had never commanded infantry before. A tired Lee, awake for the past 24 hours, met with Stuart at 3:30 in the morning of May 3rd. Aware of Jackson's desire to cut off Hooker's line of retreat, Lee was far more concerned about the separated state of his outnumbered army and was unwilling to push his luck. He and Stuart agreed to consolidate their forces and push the Union out of Chancellorsville, through the wilderness, and back to Ely's and U.S. Fords. The fighting that morning took place over Hazel Grove and Fairview Knoll, 2 elevated positions overlooking the collapsed Union right and center. The Confederates quickly seized first position by 6:30 a.m. and, under the guidance of Colonel E.P. Alexander, created a 30-gun battery to bombard the second eminence. Fairview Knoll, however, proved a tougher nut to crack, with multiple lines of defense, fallback positions and breastworks to supplement the natural defensive position. Piecemeal assaults from 2nd Corps went nowhere, with some units suffering over 50% casualties. By 9:15 a.m., the Confederates had only taken 2 Union lines, and momentum was beginning to turn against them when fate intervened once more. General Hooker had been watching the action from the porch at Chancellor House when an artillery shell struck the porch beam he had been leaning against right above his head. Hooker was thrown to the ground, unconscious. His staff, gathering around him, feared he is dead. In a few minutes, however, the commander regained consciousness and, in a show of bravado, paraded around on his white horse until his staff persuaded him to retire to a safer location. Shortly afterwards, Hooker complained of an intense headache. A modern medical diagnosis suggests he had suffered a concussion. He called for his friend and confidant, General Couch, who, realizing the state of his commander's condition, expected to be given temporary command of the Army of the Potomac. Surprisingly, Hooker refused to relinquish command, using Couch instead as a personal secretary and mouthpiece. This merely bogged down the reception of information and the execution of orders, and exacerbated the sluggishness of any Union response.
Side note, I was going to click pause and say it, and I forgot at the time. I got sidetracked by the video. The church that Stonewall Jackson went to and eventually he died at, that church, I believe it's still standing. Well, there's a structure there. I just don't know if it's the original structure. But I do know that if it's not the original structure, it was built pretty much right on the same grounds. But the front door where you walked in is the original front door. So I want to say it was destroyed or burned down, but the front door maybe wouldn't have been burned down. But anyways, the front door of the structure where you can go visit today it's I almost said real. Of course it's real. It's authentic. That's the word I'm thinking of.
As Lee sent the divisions of Anderson and McLaws to increase the Confederate onslaught, an enfeebled Hooker ordered Couch to evacuate the Chancellorsville position at 10 a.m. Two entire corps, 1st and 5th, have barely been committed. Making matters worse, as Union forces withdrew, the house and the woods around it caught fire. The agonizing screams of the wounded trapped in the inferno tormented the survivors during the retreat. Despite still being outnumbered, and with 2nd Corps clearly exhausted after the endeavors of the past 24 hours, Lee and Stuart sought to press their advantage. The Army's cavalry were dispatched to seal the northern forts over the Rapidan, channeling Hooker towards the single U.S. ford and his pontoon bridges. It is possible that with his back to the river, a broken Hooker might surrender en masse. Just as the horsemen moved out, however, Lee received startling news from General Early. Sedgwick had broken through the lines at Fredericksburg and was moving down the turnpike towards his rear. All throughout May 1st and 2nd, Early had bluffed the Union forces successfully, but on the evening of the 2nd day had received word through Lee updating him on Jackson's ambitious flank assault. A misinterpretation of the news caused Early to think that Lee desperately needed him. That evening, he set off with most of his division, leaving only a small brigade of Mississippians under General Barksdale to hold the heights. At 7 a.m. on May 3rd, Sedgwick, reinforced by Gibbon's division from 2nd Corps and urged once more by Hooker into action, attacked Marye's Heights. Wildly outnumbered, Barksdale's men stopped 2 separate assaults. Under the guise of a flag of truce to collect the wounded, however, an observant Union officer saw how few men actually held the line and urged his superiors to press the advance with all their disposable force. The 3rd Union assault began at 10 a.m. Within 25 minutes, the heights had been taken, and the Confederates were in full retreat south along Telegraph Road. Yet at this moment, Sedgwick critically dallied, wanting fresh troops to lead the advance along the turnpike and ostensibly waiting for a victorious Hooker to show up in the Confederate rear. 5 hours of valuable time were wasted, permitting Early to set up a defensive perimeter by Salem Church and allowed Barksdale's defeated troops to regroup. Even after Sedgwick moved out in mid-afternoon, an active defense by General Cadmus Wilcox, taking advantage of every small ridge that crosses the Orange Plank Road, slowed the Union advance to a crawl. That evening,
the communication back then is terrible. Breaking news, if you didn't know. I mean, Sedgwick might as well just stood there and yelled, "What's going on over there?" That's pretty much what he did. If you're going to stand around for 5 hours, I don't know how long it would... I mean, he could have sent a rider. I don't know how long it would have taken. But unless that would have taken 5 hours, then you've wasted too much time.
Wilcox set up a more determined defensive position, erecting breastworks near the vicinity of Salem Church. An assault at 5:30 p.m. by Sedgwick was halted in its tracks by the timely arrival of Confederate reinforcements. That evening, Sedgwick detached a ford north to keep Banks's Ford open in case a retreat was necessary, while Lee sent even more reinforcements under Lafayette McLaws to bolster Wilcox's position. Upon his arrival, McLaws set up south of the Union lines, while General Early moved further east, aiming to recapture Fredericksburg and surround Sedgwick, or else pin him against the Rappahannock, where he could be destroyed. For all the dramatic movement of the past 3 days, the last phase of the Battle of Chancellorsville was anticlimactic. Although General Early did his part in retaking Fredericksburg and driving Gibbon across the Rappahannock, General McLaws proved strangely lethargic, refusing to push decisively against Sedgwick. By the time Lee had arrived on the field with the remainder of Anderson's divisions, precious time had been lost maneuvering and counter-maneuvering. And now, the thoroughly exhausted Confederate army could only muster a half-hearted attack at 6 p.m. The assault soon petered out in the growing evening fog, and Sedgwick evacuated across Banks's Ford that night. Rain fell that evening and into the morning of May 5th. By 9 a.m. on May 6th, all Union forces were across the Rappahannock once more. The most immediate consequence of the battles of Chancellorsville and Salem Church was felt within the Confederacy. Although Stonewall Jackson's amputation had been successful, pneumonia set in, and the general whom Lee referred to as his right arm died on May 10th. The blow was both psychological as well as practical, as Lee was forced to reorganize his army into 3 corps. Lamentably, neither of the new corps commanders, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, had the vision or initiative of Jackson, with the result that Lee was forced to resort to more defensive strategies and tactics. Undaunted by the loss, however, Lee...
I'll say this about Jackson. Jackson could get on a horse, look at a crowd of, 6,000, and he could have 1,000, and he would be like, okay, let's go. Like, he just had no fear. I'll give Jackson credit for that. He had no fear.
Would seize the strategic initiative after a few weeks' rest. In early June, he moved his army into the Shenandoah Valley and headed north. The still shattered Hooker limply shadowed this second invasion before he was relieved of command in mid-June and sent to the Western Theater. His replacement, the irascible George Meade, would decisively shatter the stalemate in the east, outside the small town of Gettysburg. The following year, as subordinate to Ulysses S. Grant, Meade would lead the Army of the Potomac back into the wilderness. Rather than disperse their superior numbers in fancy maneuvering, Meade and Grant would use their army as a hammer, dealing blow after blow to the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately bringing it to its knees at Appomattox Courthouse. If you stayed around this far, thank you for...
The one thing I love about the end of the end of the battle, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, I don't remember, and I'm sure some of you probably know this, but the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, the homeowner where they met, and I forgot his name, but anyways, he was witness to the surrender of Robert E. Lee at his home where Grant and everyone showed up. But he lived near Manassas, which was the very first battle, Manassas Junction or Battle of Bull Run, depending on which side you're on. They call it different things. But that battle took place right near his home, the opening battle to the Civil War. So he fled. He fled to Appomattox Courthouse thinking he was safe, and in his living room is where the final handshake agreement took place. So that's a little, it's kind of known now, but it's still, you know, for anybody who's not an American, I don't remember the guy's name right offhand. I do want to check something. What I said about Richard Rowland Kirkland. Richard Rowland Kirkland, Chancellorsville? Are you not going to? There it goes. Okay, he was at Fredericksburg. So that was the battle before. Okay, yep. That was before. So I gave him credit for the Chancellorsville, and he died in the Battle of Chickamauga, September 20th, 1863. So this was 1860. So he died later that year. It's sad. Okay. But I was saying the Marion Heights or whatever, that's what they call him, because at Fredericksburg there's a little section there, Marion Heights, and so he was, or Fredericksburg's here, and like the Marion Heights is down here, kind of a little out of the way, and that was where the battle took place, even though it's labeled Fredericksburg. It took place in Fredericksburg as well. But the Battle of Marion, the Angel of Marion Heights, because that's what he's called, and there's a statue there and stuff like that. I've been to Chickamauga, and I didn't know about him dying there until after. And I think that he's a figure that it would be interesting to have a little thing like, you know, because I think he's even though, you know, he's a Confederate, to me, Confederate bad, but I think that his actions were admirable, clearly, and well deserving of a statue for what he did. And so there's not a whole lot I can do now but just keep talking, and no one wants to hear that. So we're going to end it here. You can donate to the channel through the thanks button. You don't have to. You can subscribe. That helps. If you don't want to subscribe, hey, I get it. You know, times are tough, and it's tough to click that button even though it's free. And same thing with the thumbs up button. I get it. Some people just don't want to do it. So until next time, have a good day, have a good night.